If you've ever felt invisible in a place where you worked every single day, if you've ever been dismissed as though your presence didn't matter, then you understand what it means to carry quiet dignity when the world refuses to see you. This channel exists for stories like these, the ones that slip through the cracks, the lives that go unnoticed until something shifts and the truth finally comes to light. If these stories resonate with you, if you believe that silent strength deserves to be witnessed, consider subscribing. You're part of a community that listens when the world looks away. Elena arrived at the hotel before dawn, just as she did every morning. The service entrance was tucked behind the building, away from the pristine marble lobby where guests arrived in taxis and luxury cars. She pushed through the heavy metal door and descended the stairs into the basement where the housekeeping staff gathered. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a cold, institutional glow. The air smelled of bleach and industrial detergent. She signed in on the clipboard without a word, her handwriting small and careful. The other women were already there, pulling on their uniforms and pinning their name tags to their chests. They spoke quietly in Spanish, their voices low and tired. Elena greeted them with a small nod, then opened her locker and changed into her pale blue uniform. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows. She tucked her hair under a white cap and closed the locker door gently. Around her, the basement filled with the muted sounds of preparation, keys rattling, carts rolling, the soft shuffle of shoes on linoleum. She had been working at the hotel for 6 years. She knew every hallway, every stairwell, every hidden corner where the staff disappeared during breaks. She knew which rooms were occupied by families with small children who left toys scattered across the floor, and which were occupied by business people who barely touched the beds. She knew the rhythm of the place, the quiet hum of invisible labor that kept everything running smoothly. But to the guests who passed her in the hallways, she was a shadow. To the managers who assigned her floors each morning, she was a number on a roster. Elena pushed her cart down the long corridor on the 8th floor. The wheels squeaked faintly. She stopped at room 804 and knocked softly, waiting a moment before using her keycard. The room was empty. She stepped inside and began the routine she had performed thousands of times, stripping the bed, wiping down surfaces, replacing towels, emptying trash. Her hands moved efficiently, mechanically. She didn't pause to look out the window at the city skyline. She didn't linger. She cleaned each room as though it were the first and the last. The work was exhausting in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the repetition, the invisibility, the knowledge that no matter how perfectly she performed her duties, she would never be more than background scenery in someone else's temporary experience. Guests left messes without thinking about who would clean them. They threw towels on the floor, spilled coffee on white linens, left half-eaten room service meals to rot. Elena cleaned it all without judgment, without resentment. This was her work. This was how she survived. She had learned to read rooms like archaeologists read excavation sites. A rumpled bed told her whether someone had slept fitfully or peacefully. Wet towels scattered on the floor suggested a rushed morning. An untouched minibar indicated a business traveler on a tight schedule. Empty champagne bottles and rose petals meant celebration or romance. These silent narratives unfolded before her daily, stories of people whose lives briefly intersected with hers through the messes they left behind. At 11:30, she took her break in the small staff room adjacent to the laundry facility. She ate her lunch quietly, a sandwich she had packed at home before leaving in the dark. The room was crowded with other workers, but no one spoke much. The television mounted on the wall played a daytime talk show no one watched. Elena chewed slowly, her mind somewhere else. She thought about her daughter who would be getting out of school in a few hours. She thought about the rent payment due at the end of the week. She thought about the worn sole on her left shoe and whether it would last another month. She thought about the letter she had received from her mother back home, asking when she might visit. She thought about the money she sent every month, how it never seemed to be enough. She thought about the English classes she had stopped attending because she couldn't afford to miss the overtime shifts. She thought about the dreams she'd had when she first arrived in this country, how small and distant they seemed now. When she first came to this city, she had imagined a different life. She had imagined learning perfect English, getting an education, working in an office somewhere with windows and natural light. She had imagined her daughter growing up with opportunities she herself never had. But the years had a way of wearing down those dreams, replacing them with more immediate concerns: rent, food, utilities, survival. When her break ended, she returned to the 8th floor. There were 12 more rooms to finish before her shift ended. She moved through them one by one, her body aching in familiar places, her lower back, her knees, her shoulders. The pain was steady and unremarkable, something she had learned to ignore. She sprayed the mirror in room 812 and wiped it clean in smooth circular motions. Her reflection appeared briefly, then disappeared beneath the clarity she created. The hotel was undergoing renovations on the lower floors, and the staff had been told that once the work was complete, there would be changes. No one had explained what kind of changes. The managers spoke in vague terms about efficiency and modernization. Some of the housekeepers whispered about layoffs, about automation, about contracts that wouldn't be renewed. Elena didn't participate in these conversations. She kept her head down and did her work. She couldn't afford to worry about things she couldn't control, but the whispers persisted. One of the older housekeepers, a woman named Rosa who had worked at the hotel for 15 years, told Elena that she'd heard rumors of a complete restructuring. The management company that ran the hotel was implementing new systems across all their properties. Fewer workers, higher quotas, stricter performance metrics. Rosa's hands shook as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She had grandchildren to support. She couldn't lose this job. Elena listened but said nothing. What could she say? They were all vulnerable. They were all replaceable. The best they could do was work harder, faster, better. Make themselves indispensable. Even though they all knew deep down that no one was truly indispensable. Rosa had been like an older sister to Elena since her first day at the hotel. She had shown her which cleaning products worked best, which managers to avoid, which guests tipped generously. She had taught her the unwritten rules of survival in a place where they were all expendable. Now Rosa's eyes carried a fear Elena had never seen before. It made Elena's own anxiety sharpen. One afternoon in early November, a new supervisor was introduced to the housekeeping staff. His name was printed on a small badge pinned to his shirt, but Elena didn't need to read it. She could see immediately that he was the kind of man who measured his authority by the sharpness of his tone. He stood at the front of the basement room with his arms crossed, surveying the women who had gathered for the briefing. He spoke quickly, listing new protocols and expectations. His eyes moved over them without settling on any individual face. Elena noticed the way he looked at her and the other women, briefly, dismissively, as though they were interchangeable. When he finished speaking, he turned and walked out without waiting for questions. The women exchanged glances but said nothing. They returned to their carts and their floors, the new rules already forgotten beneath the weight of everything else they carried. But the new rules didn't stay forgotten for long. Within days, the changes became apparent. The supervisor appeared on the floors with increasing frequency, clipboard in hand, checking rooms that had already been cleaned. He would run his finger along surfaces, looking for dust. He would inspect corners, behind furniture, inside drawers. He found faults that the previous supervisors had never noticed or cared about. He seemed to take particular interest in finding imperfections, a water spot on a faucet, a minor wrinkle in a bedspread, hair towel folded with the tag showing instead of hidden. Things that guests would never notice, things that had never mattered before, suddenly became evidence of inadequate performance. The pressure began subtly. New quotas were introduced. The number of rooms each housekeeper was expected to clean per shift increased from 14 to 18. The time allotted for breaks was reduced from 30 minutes to 20. The supervisors walked the floors more frequently now, clipboards in hand, checking for imperfections. Elena found herself working faster, skipping her breaks to stay on schedule. She ate her lunch standing up in the hallway between rooms. Her hands, already dry and cracked from the cleaning chemicals, became raw and painful. She started arriving 15 minutes early each day, unpaid, just to get a head start. She stayed late, also unpaid, to finish her quota. The other housekeepers did the same. They moved through the hallways like ghosts, racing against impossible expectations. their bodies breaking down incrementally. Elena began to notice the physical toll on her colleagues. Carmen, who worked the floor below hers, developed a persistent cough that never seemed to go away. Maria's limp became more pronounced each week. Rosa's hands trembled more noticeably when she gripped her cart handle. They were all slowly wearing down, their bodies giving out under the relentless pressure. One morning, the new supervisor stopped her in the hallway as she was pushing her cart toward the next room. He looked at her briefly, then gestured toward the cart. He asked why she hadn't finished the previous floor yet. Eleanor explained quietly that one of the rooms had required extra attention. A large family had checked out and left the space in disarray. There had been food ground into the carpet, permanent marker on the walls, a broken lamp that she'd had to report to maintenance. He cut her off before she could finish. He told her that excuses didn't matter. He told her that if she couldn't keep up, there were others who could. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, which made the words cut deeper. He wasn't angry. He was simply stating a fact. She stood there in the hallway, the fluorescent lights humming above her, and said nothing. He walked away without waiting for a response. She stood there for a moment longer, her hands gripping the handle of the cart, then continued to the next room. Her face remained calm, but something inside her had shifted, a small, quiet acknowledgement that the ground beneath her was no longer stable. That evening, as she rode the bus home, she stared out the window at the city passing by. People walked the sidewalks with purpose, entering restaurants, hailing taxis, laughing with friends. The world moved around her, indifferent to her struggle. She wondered if any of them had ever felt as invisible as she did. She wondered if any of them understood what it meant to work yourself to exhaustion and still be told it wasn't enough. The weeks that followed brought more encounters. The new supervisor seemed to appear whenever Elena was behind schedule. He made comments about her pace, her efficiency, her attention to detail. He never raised his voice, he didn't need to. His words were sharp and deliberate, delivered in a tone that suggested disappointment rather than anger. To him, she wasn't a person with a name and a history. She was a problem to be managed. One afternoon, he found her cleaning a bathroom and pointed out a small spot on the mirror she had missed. It was barely visible, the size of a pinhead. He told her that this was unacceptable. He told her that guests paid premium prices and expected perfection. He told her to redo the entire room. Eleanor had already cleaned 3 other rooms since finishing that one. She would have to abandon her current schedule, go back, re-clean a room that was already pristine except for one microscopic spot. She would fall further behind. She would have to skip lunch. She would have to stay late. She nodded and went back. She re-cleaned the entire room, every surface, every corner, even though nothing else needed attention. When she finished, she was 45 minutes behind schedule. She worked through lunch. She worked through her break. She stayed an hour past her shift, unpaid, to finish her quota. The other housekeepers began to notice a pattern. The supervisor seemed to target certain workers more than others. Elena was one of them. So was Carmen, who spoke limited English. So was an older woman named Luz, who moved more slowly due to arthritis. The supervisor seemed to focus his attention on those he perceived as most vulnerable, those least likely to push back. Other housekeepers noticed. They saw the way he singled her out, the way his scrutiny seemed to follow her from floor to floor. But no one said anything. They couldn't afford to. They had their own quotas to meet, their own supervisors to appease. Elena understood this. She didn't expect them to intervene. She kept her head down and worked faster, but no matter how fast she worked, it wasn't enough. The supervisor found new faults, new imperfections, new reasons to criticize. A towel folded incorrectly. A pillow placed at the wrong angle. A minor streak on a window. Things that had never mattered before suddenly became grounds for reprimand. He began leaving notes on her cart, small yellow sticky notes with criticisms written in tight, precise handwriting. Room 847, bathroom mirror has streaks. Room 823, bedspread not centered. Room 801, trash can liner showing. Elena collected these notes, placing them in her locker at the end of each shift. She didn't know why she kept them. Perhaps as evidence. Perhaps as a reminder that she wasn't imagining the persecution. One afternoon she was called into the basement office. The new supervisor was there, along with another manager she didn't recognize. They asked her to sit. She sat. They told her that her performance had been inconsistent. They told her that several guests had complained about the condition of their rooms. They slid a piece of paper across the desk toward her, a formal warning. Elena looked at the paper. She wanted to ask which guests had complained. She wanted to see the complaints themselves. She wanted to know which rooms, which specific issues, which dates, because she knew with absolute certainty that she had cleaned every room to the same meticulous standard she had maintained for 6 years. But she didn't ask. She knew it wouldn't matter. The complaints might be real or they might be fabricated. Either way, the warning was being issued. The paper was already prepared, already printed, already waiting for her signature. She signed where they pointed and stood up. They dismissed her without another word. She walked back to her cart, her hands trembling slightly, and resumed her work. Later, during a brief moment in the basement, Rosa pulled her aside. "They did the same thing to Gabriella last month," she whispered. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Gabriella had been a good worker, meticulous and fast. If they could push her out, they could push anyone out. That night, she lay awake in the small apartment she shared with her daughter. The walls were thin. She could hear the neighbor's television through the plaster, the muffled voices of a late-night talk show. Her daughter slept in the next room, her breathing soft and steady. Elena stared at the ceiling and thought about the formal warning sitting in her file. She thought about the rent payment, the groceries, the electricity bill. She thought about the worn sole on her shoe and how much longer it would hold. She thought about the 6 years she had given to this hotel. 6 years of arriving before dawn and leaving after dark. 6 years of breathing chemical fumes and scrubbing other people's messes. 6 years of invisibility and silence. And now, after all that, she was one more infraction away from termination. The weight of it all settled on her chest like a physical thing, pressing down until her breath became shallow. She had worked so hard to build this life. She had crossed borders, learned a new language, taken jobs no one else wanted. She had done everything right, followed every rule, kept her head down and her voice quiet. And still it wasn't enough. Still she was expendable. She thought about her daughter, about the future she was trying to create for her. She thought about the money she sent home to her mother every month, about the promises she had made to return someday. She thought about the years she had spent in this hotel, cleaning rooms and emptying trash and replacing towels, invisible to everyone who passed her in the hallways. She thought about her daughter's upcoming school field trip, the permission slip that required a $20 payment. She thought about the winter coat her daughter had outgrown, how she'd been making do with a too small jacket. She thought about all the small ways she had been failing, despite working herself to exhaustion. The silence in the apartment was profound. Outside, the city continued its endless hum. Cars passing, sirens wailing in the distance, the faint murmur of voices drifting up from the street. But inside, there was only stillness. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind refused to quiet. She lay there until the first light of dawn began to filter through the thin curtains, then rose and prepared for another day. The next morning she arrived at the hotel before sunrise. She signed in, changed into her uniform and pushed her cart down the hallway to begin her shift. The new supervisor was already there, walking the floors with his clipboard. He didn't acknowledge her as she passed. She didn't expect him to. She cleaned room after room, her movements automatic, her mind somewhere else. She thought about nothing and everything at once. She thought about the way the supervisor's eyes had moved over her without seeing her. She thought about the formal warning in her file. She thought about her daughter's face when she picked her up from school, the way she smiled and reached for her hand. The days acquired a mechanical quality. Wake at 4:30. Prepare her daughter's breakfast and lunch. Wake her daughter at 5:45. Walk her to the neighbor who watched her until school started. Catch the bus at 6:15. Arrive at the hotel by 6:45. Change. Sign in. Push the cart. Clean, clean, clean. Avoid the supervisor. Meet the quotas. Skip breaks. Stay late. Catch the bus home, pick up her daughter, make dinner, help with homework, put her to bed, lie awake, worrying. Sleep for a few hours. Repeat. Her body began to show the strain. Her hands bled from the constant exposure to chemicals. She wrapped them in bandages each night, applying cheap lotion she bought at the dollar store, but the cracks only deepened. Her back seized up some mornings, requiring 10 minutes of careful stretching before she could stand upright. Her knees ached constantly. She developed a persistent cough from the cleaning product fumes, but she couldn't afford to call in sick. Sick days were unpaid, and besides, calling in sick would give the supervisor another reason to criticize her reliability. She began taking pain medication just to make it through her shifts, over-the-counter pills that barely touched the deep ache in her joints. She rationed them carefully, taking one in the morning and saving one for the afternoon when the pain became unbearable. At noon one day, she was cleaning a room on the 9th floor when she heard voices in the hallway. She paused, listening. The new supervisor was speaking to someone, his tone sharper than usual. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the rhythm of his voice, clipped, impatient, dismissive. She continued wiping down the bathroom counter, her hands moving in slow, steady circles. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the open door. She turned. The supervisor stood there with another man she didn't recognize. The second man was older, dressed in a suit. He looked at her briefly, then looked around the room. The supervisor said something to him in a low voice, gesturing toward the unmade bed, the cart in the hallway. The older man nodded, his expression neutral. Eleanor stood there holding the cleaning cloth, waiting. The supervisor turned to her and told her to finish the room and move on. She nodded. They left. She stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, then returned to her work. She didn't know who the man in the suit was, a corporate auditor perhaps, or someone from the management company headquarters. It didn't matter. All that mattered was staying invisible, staying out of trouble, finishing her quota. The days blurred together. The quotas increased again, from 18 rooms to 20. It was impossible, physically impossible. Even working through every break, even arriving early and staying late, Elena couldn't clean 20 rooms to the exacting standards the supervisor demanded. No one could. The mathematics of it were cruel. 20 rooms at roughly 30 minutes each meant 10 hours of continuous work with no breaks, no interruptions, no complications. But there were always complications. Rooms that required extra attention, guests who returned unexpectedly, equipment that malfunctioned. The quota was designed to be unachievable. The other housekeepers began to crack under the pressure. One woman, Carmen, who had worked at the hotel for 8 years, broke down crying in the basement locker room. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't pin her name tag to her uniform. Rosa, the oldest of them, developed a limp from a knee injury she couldn't afford to have treated. Another woman simply stopped showing up one day. No one knew if she'd quit or been fired. Her locker was emptied and reassigned within 24 hours. Elena watched these disappearances with growing dread. Each woman who left was a reminder of her own precarious position. She wondered who would be next. She wondered how long she could hold on. Elena kept working. She had no choice. She had a daughter who needed food and shelter and school supplies. She had a mother back home who depended on her monthly wire transfer. She had rent and utilities and a medical bill from her daughter's ear infection last month. She had no savings, no safety net, no alternative. She began to have nightmares. In them, she was cleaning an endless hallway of identical rooms, each one dirtier than the last, the supervisor following behind her with his clipboard, finding fault with everything she touched. She would wake in the dark, her heart racing, unsure for a moment where she was. One evening, as she was preparing to leave, the supervisor called her into the office again. This time, he was alone. He told her that the hotel was restructuring its housekeeping department. He told her that her position was being eliminated. He slid a piece of paper across the desk, a termination notice. He told her she had 2 weeks. She looked at the paper. She looked at him. She said nothing. He dismissed her. She walked out of the office, past the other housekeepers who avoided her gaze, and left the building through the service entrance. The night air was cold. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her breath visible in the dim light, then began the long walk home. She walked because she couldn't bear to sit still on the bus. She walked because the movement kept her from thinking. She walked because if she stopped moving, she might collapse. The city moved around her. People hurrying home from work, cars honking, restaurants filling with evening diners. The world continued as though nothing had changed. But for Elena, everything had changed. She passed a restaurant where well-dressed people sat at outdoor tables, laughing and drinking wine. She passed a storefront window displaying expensive clothes she could never afford. She passed a playground where children played while their parents watched from benches. Normal life happening all around her, while her own life crumbled. She didn't tell her daughter that night. She didn't tell anyone. She went to work the next day and the day after that, cleaning rooms as she always had. The other housekeepers knew. News traveled quickly in the basement, but no one spoke of it. They offered her small gestures of solidarity, a nod in the hallway, an extra break, a shared lunch. But words were too dangerous. Words could get you noticed. Rosa pressed a small bag into her hand one day. Homemade tamales, still warm. "For you and your little one," she whispered. Elena's eyes burned with tears she couldn't shed. Not here. Not where anyone could see. Elena continued to work in silence. She cleaned each room with the same meticulous care, even though she knew it no longer mattered. She replaced the towels, wiped the mirrors, vacuumed the floors. She did her job as though she still had a future there, as though the termination notice didn't exist. She thought about what she would do in 2 weeks, where she would look for work, how she would explain the gap in employment, whether anyone would hire a woman in her 40s with limited English and no formal education. She thought about how long her small savings would last. Maybe a month if she was careful, maybe 6 weeks if she was lucky. She thought about telling her daughter, about finding the words to explain that things would be different for a while, that they might have to move to a cheaper apartment, that there might not be money for new school clothes or the field trip coming up, that everything Elena had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, hadn't been enough to keep them safe. On her second to last day, she was cleaning a room on the 10th floor when she found a document wedged behind the nightstand. It was a single sheet of paper, folded and slightly crumpled. She pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a contract, a lease agreement for the hotel building itself. She didn't understand most of the legal language, but she recognized the name at the bottom. It was signed by someone she had never heard of. She didn't know why she paid attention to it. It was just another piece of paper left behind by a careless guest. But something about it caught her eye, the official letterhead, the formal language, the signature. She refolded the paper and placed it on the desk. She finished cleaning the room and moved on to the next, but the name stayed with her. That evening, before she left, she mentioned it to Rosa, the older housekeeper who had worked at the hotel for over a decade. Rosa's expression changed immediately. Her eyes widened slightly, and she gripped Elena's arm. She told Elena that the name belonged to the owner of the hotel, the real owner, not the management company that ran day-to-day operations. She said the owner hadn't been seen in years, that most people assumed he had sold his stake or moved on to other properties. She said there were rumors he'd been living abroad, that he'd left the hotel in the hands of managers and forgotten about it. But why would his contract be in a guest room? Elena asked quietly. Rosa shook her head. Maybe he's back. Maybe someone is reviewing the lease. Maybe, she trailed off, her expression thoughtful, maybe someone is checking on how things are being run. Elena went home that night with the name still circling in her mind. She didn't know why it mattered. She didn't know what difference it could make. But something about it felt significant, like a detail everyone had overlooked. She lay in bed that night thinking about the contract, about the owner who had disappeared, about the management company that ran the hotel with such cold efficiency. She thought about the new supervisor and his systematic cruelty, about the impossible quotas and the fabricated complaints. She thought about all the other housekeepers who had been pushed out over the years, all the invisible workers who had been discarded without a second thought. And she thought about the document behind the nightstand, forgotten and gathering dust, waiting for someone to notice. The next day, her last day, she arrived at the hotel and signed in as she always had. She changed into her uniform and pushed her cart down the hallway. The basement was quieter than usual. Some of the other housekeepers had already heard that Eleanor's position was being eliminated. They didn't know what to say, so they said nothing. Eleanor worked through her shift in silence. She cleaned each room with the same precision, the same care. She didn't rush. She didn't cut corners. She did her job as though it still meant something. At 2 in the afternoon, as she was finishing a room on the 7th floor, she heard commotion in the hallway. Voices, multiple voices, urgent and overlapping. She stepped out of the room and saw a group of people gathered near the elevators. Among them was the new supervisor, his face pale and tense. Next to him stood the older man in the suit she had seen weeks before, and next to him was another man, elderly, well-dressed, his posture upright and commanding. Eleanor recognized him immediately. She had seen his photograph in the employee break room years ago, before it was taken down and replaced with corporate branding. He was the owner, the real owner, the one no one had seen in years. The group moved down the hallway, their voices carrying. The supervisor was speaking quickly, defensively, gesturing toward the rooms. The owner said nothing. He simply walked, his eyes scanning the hallway, the walls, the doors. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, a sharpness, an attention to detail that the managers lacked. When he reached the room Elena had just finished cleaning, he stopped. He stepped inside. The others followed. Eleanor stood in the hallway, her hands gripping the handle of her cart. She didn't move, she didn't speak, she waited. She could hear their voices through the open door. The owner was asking questions about cleaning protocols, about staff training, about guest satisfaction scores. The supervisor answered quickly, confidently, but there was something strained in his voice. Then she heard the owner ask about staffing levels, about turnover rates, about the recent terminations. The supervisor's voice faltered. He spoke about efficiency measures, about performance standards, about the need to maintain profitability. The owner's response was quiet, but his tone was sharp. "Show me the complaints, all of them." A few minutes later, the owner emerged. He looked at the supervisor, then at the man in the suit. He said something in a low, firm voice. The supervisor's face went rigid. The man in the suit nodded and began taking notes. The owner turned and continued down the hallway, the group following. Eleanor watched them disappear around the corner. Her heart was pounding. She didn't know what had just happened, but she felt the shift in the air, a sudden, undeniable change. She returned to her cart and continued working. She had 3 more rooms to clean before her shift ended. She moved through them mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She thought about the owner's sudden appearance, about the tension in the supervisor's voice, about the way the man in the suit had taken notes. Later that afternoon, she was called into the basement office. She expected the supervisor to be there, but instead, it was the man in the suit. He asked her to sit. She sat. He introduced himself as the hotel's director of operations, reporting directly to the ownership. He told her that there had been an internal review of the housekeeping department. He told her that several discrepancies had been discovered, falsified guest complaints, manipulated performance records, improper terminations. He told her that the management company's practices were under investigation. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was her termination notice, stamped in red ink, void. He told her that her position was being reinstated. He told her that the new supervisor was being investigated for misconduct. He told her that she would receive back pay for the weeks she had been unfairly penalized, including the unpaid overtime she had worked. He told her that the owner had personally reviewed her employment file and found no legitimate basis for termination. He told her that the hotel was implementing new oversight procedures to prevent future abuses. Elena looked at the paper. She looked at him. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she simply nodded. He asked if she had any questions. She had many questions, but her voice wouldn't form them. She shook her head. He dismissed her. She stood and walked out of the office, the voided termination notice in her hand. The basement was silent as she made her way to her locker. The other housekeepers watched her, their expressions unreadable. Eleanor changed out of her uniform, folded it carefully and placed it in her locker. She would return tomorrow. She would continue her work. But something fundamental had shifted. Rosa, the older housekeeper, stepped forward. She didn't say anything. She simply placed a hand on Elena's shoulder and squeezed gently. Elena nodded. Then she walked up the stairs and out through the service entrance into the late afternoon light. The air was cool. The city stretched out before her, vast and indifferent. She stood there for a moment, the voided notice still in her hand, then folded it and placed it in her pocket. She began the walk home, her steps steady and unhurried. When she arrived at her apartment, her daughter was waiting. She ran to the door and wrapped her arms around Elena's waist. Elena held her, her hand resting gently on her daughter's head. She didn't tell her what had happened, not yet. For now, she simply held her. That night, after her daughter had gone to bed, Elena sat at the small table in the kitchen. The apartment was quiet. She thought about the years she had spent at the hotel, the invisible labor, the silent endurance. She thought about the supervisor and his sharp words, the formal warnings, the termination notice. She thought about the owner appearing after all those years, seeing what everyone else had refused to see. She thought about the voided notice in her pocket, the back pay she would receive, the position that had been restored. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, how fragile her stability had always been. But more than anything, she thought about the document she had found behind the nightstand, the name she had mentioned to Rosa. She thought about the chain of events that had followed, small, quiet, seemingly insignificant, a forgotten contract, a casual conversation, a detail no one else had noticed. She realized then that her silence hadn't been weakness, it had been survival, and in the end, it had been enough. Eleanor stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the city lights, the endless sprawl of buildings and streets and lives lived in quiet obscurity. Somewhere out there, others were enduring what she had endured. Somewhere out there, others were carrying burdens no one else could see. She placed her hand against the glass, feeling the cold seep through. Then she turned and walked back to the table, sat down and allowed herself for the first time in weeks to breathe. The next morning she returned to work. She signed in at the usual time, changed into her uniform and pushed her cart down the hallway. But the atmosphere in the basement had changed. The new supervisor was gone. In his place was an older woman, someone who had worked her way up from housekeeping years before. She greeted the staff by name. She asked about their families. She listened. The quotas were reduced back to reasonable levels, 14 rooms per shift, the same as before the restructuring. The constant surveillance stopped. The fabricated complaints disappeared. The hotel continued to operate, but the cruelty had been excised. Eleanor worked her shift as she always had, with precision and care. But now, when guests passed her in the hallway, some of them nodded. Some of them said thank you. Small gestures, but they mattered. At the end of her shift, Elena signed out and changed out of her uniform. Rosa was waiting for her by the lockers. She asked if Elena wanted to get coffee. Elena nodded. They walked together up the stairs and out into the evening air. They sat in a small cafe 2 blocks from the hotel. 2 women who had spent years invisible, now visible to each other. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't need to. They simply sat together, drinking their coffee, existing in the world as people who mattered. When Elena finally walked home that night, her daughter met her at the door, as always. But this time, when her daughter asked how her day had been, Elena smiled and said it had been good, and it was true. If you've ever been dismissed by people who never took the time to see your worth, I'd like to hear about it in the comments below.